I'm sharing this terrible event that happened to me because it's something that still crosses my mind from time to time. It's been 5 years now. I'll introduce myself as Maria because I don't want to expose myself. Every evening after work, I made a stop at the small cafe down the street. It was a quiet place with soft lighting and the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee, offering a brief moment of peace before heading home to the usual busyness of life. The baristas knew me by name, and it felt good to be greeted with a friendly smile after a long day. I always sat by the window where I could watch the evening unfold outside while sipping my coffee. It had become a cherished routine, a way to slow down before diving back into responsibilities. The familiar rhythm of this ritual was something I looked forward to. The cafe was especially quiet that night, only a couple of people sitting at distant tables, immersed in their own worlds. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into my palms, feeling grateful for these few moments of stillness. The soft jingle of the bell above the door broke the quiet hum of the cafe. I glanced up and saw a man enter, his tall frame silhouetted against the streetlights outside. He had a child with him, a boy no older than 8, clutching the man's coat as if afraid to let go. Something about the man felt off. He scanned the room slowly, his gaze lingering on each person until it stopped on me. His stare lasted just a second too long. I looked away, hoping to shake off the strange feeling stirring in my chest. I shifted in my seat, trying to refocus on my coffee. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was reading too much into a harmless situation. But the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. A few minutes later, the man approached my table. He smiled, a polite but hollow expression, and struck up a conversation as if we were old acquaintances. His voice was calm, his words casual, but his presence felt deliberate, too close for comfort. I forced a small smile, hoping it would encourage him to move on. "Just waiting out the cold?" I asked politely, hoping it would be enough to end the interaction. He nodded, but something in his expression didn't change. "Yeah, it's quiet tonight, isn't it?" I responded curtly, keeping my answers short. There was no reason for this conversation, and every second it dragged on, the discomfort grew. The child stood silently next to him, not saying a word, his eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man gave a small nod and walked away, guiding the child toward a table near the door. I exhaled, realizing how tense I'd been. But even with him sitting across the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I finished my coffee, I gathered my things and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The streetlights cast long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot, and the few scattered cars stood under their dim glow. As I walked toward my car, I glanced around instinctively. That's when I saw him, the man from the cafe. He was standing at the edge of the lot, partially hidden in the shadows, watching me. A cold wave of fear rolled over me. He didn't move, just stood there, still and silent, as if waiting. My heart raced as I realized how alone I was. I quickened my pace, hoping the distance between us would grow fast enough. But the moment I reached my car, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. He was following me. The footsteps were quick, deliberate, and too close for comfort. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with my keys, trying desperately to unlock the car door. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped them. I stole a glance over my shoulder. He was closing the distance, walking faster now, his shadowed figure blending into the darkness. The lock finally clicked, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. But just as I reached for the lock button, the man was there. His hand latched onto the door handle, pulling it with force, trying to wrench it open before I could lock it. With trembling fingers, I slammed the lock down. The sound of the lock engaging was the only thing standing between me and the man now yanking violently on the handle. I sat frozen for a second, my breath coming in shallow gasps as he continued to pull at the handle with increasing desperation. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but I could see enough: his wild eyes, his twisted expression, the unmistakable intent to get inside. My body reacted before my mind could. I twisted the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. Without hesitating, I threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing as I backed out of the parking space. The sudden movement startled him, and he stumbled back, releasing the handle just as I jerked the steering wheel and peeled out of the lot. The headlights caught him for a split second, his face blank, the child standing eerily still beside him. I didn't look back again. By the time I reached home, my hands were still shaking. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. My husband was in the living room, his face instantly shifting from confusion to concern when he saw the state I was in. "What happened?" he asked, rushing over as I collapsed onto the couch, trying to catch my breath. I told him everything: the strange encounter at the cafe, the man's unsettling presence, and the terrifying moment when he tried to get into my car. My voice wavered as I described the child's eerie stillness and the way the man had chased me to my car without saying a word. His face darkened as he listened, anger flashing in his eyes. "How could someone do that?" he muttered, pacing the room. "And no one at the cafe noticed." I shook my head, still rattled by the encounter. "I don't know. It happened so fast." He sat down beside me, wrapping his arms around me, but even in the warmth of his embrace, I felt the fear lingering just beneath the surface. Though I was home, the fear didn't leave me. My safe, familiar world now felt fragile, like the comforting routine I'd loved so much could be shattered at any moment. The cafe had been my escape, a place where I could unwind and find peace. But now that peace was tainted by the memory of what had happened. I knew I would think twice before stopping there again, haunted by the fear that he, or someone like him, might be waiting. As I lay in bed that night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man standing in the shadows of the parking lot, his hand on the door handle, the child standing silently beside him. My husband's soft breathing beside me should have been a comfort, but it wasn't enough to chase away the unease. The fear wasn't overwhelming. It was subtle, creeping at the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't quite outrun. I knew I was safe, for now. But I also knew things would never feel quite the same again. The drive home felt endless. It had been a long day at work, and I was exhausted. The sun hung low on the horizon, stretching shadows across the narrow road as I made my way through the small village. I'd taken this route many times before, always enjoying the peaceful stillness of the place. The village was quiet, as usual, just a scattering of old houses, fading paint peeling off their walls, and winding roads that twisted through the countryside. The hum of the car engine and the rhythm of tires against the asphalt were beginning to lull me into a daze. Then I saw them, an old woman and two children standing by the roadside. Something about their stillness caught my attention. The woman leaned on a cane, her worn shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, while the children stood quietly beside her, looking down the road as if waiting for someone. I hesitated for a moment, but then guilt tugged at me. I couldn't just drive past. I pulled the car over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a lift?" I asked, trying to keep my voice friendly. The old woman smiled, her eyes warm but tired. "That would be a great help," she said. "We live not far from here. Just follow the road a bit further into the village." There was nothing outwardly threatening about them. The children clutched small bags, looking shy and quiet. I told myself it was just a kind gesture, helping someone in need. People still did that, right? They climbed into the car, the old woman thanking me softly as I pulled back onto the road. But as we drove, the uneasy feeling began to settle in the pit of my stomach. The house they directed me to stood at the edge of the village, old and crumbling, with windows boarded up and ivy crawling over its walls. It looked abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a ghost story. I parked the car, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Are you sure this is it?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. Before the old woman could respond, shadows shifted around the house. Men emerged, silent and quick, surrounding the car before I had time to react. My heart pounded as the realization hit me. It was a trap. The door was yanked open, and rough hands dragged me out of the driver's seat. I tried to fight, but there were too many of them. They wrestled me to the ground, pinning my arms behind my back as one of them muttered something in a low voice. The old woman stood nearby, her earlier warmth gone, replaced by a cold, detached expression. I was pulled to my feet and dragged toward the house, the door slamming shut behind me. Inside the house, the air was heavy with dust and decay. They tied me to a chair, the ropes digging painfully into my wrists. The room was dim, lit only by a weak bulb that buzzed overhead. The gang left me alone, their footsteps fading as they moved to another room. I sat in the silence, my pulse thundering in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could hear them arguing through the walls, their voices rising and falling as they discussed what to do next. Fragments of their conversation drifted into the room, but nothing made sense. Just bits about keeping quiet and getting rid of the car. I tugged at the ropes binding my wrists, trying to loosen them without making noise. Every second felt endless, my heart pounding as I imagined all the ways this night could end. Then I felt it, a slight give in the knot. My pulse quickened. If I could just get out of the chair without them noticing. The ropes loosened, slipping from my wrists with a quiet snap. My hands were free. I rubbed them quickly, trying to ease the stiffness, then listened carefully. The arguing continued in the other room, angry voices clashing, distracted. This was my only chance. I stood slowly, every movement deliberate and silent. My heart raced as I tiptoed toward the front door, praying the floorboards wouldn't creak beneath my weight. The doorknob felt cold in my hand as I twisted it. The door swung open with a groan, but the arguing inside the house drowned out the sound. I stepped into the cool night air, closing the door softly behind me. The yard was overgrown, weeds brushing against my legs as I crouched low among the bushes. I could hear the gang inside, still oblivious to my escape. The night stretched out around me, quiet, dark, and full of possibilities for those who knew how to run. Without looking back, I sprinted into the night, my legs burning with every step. The ground was uneven, but adrenaline kept me upright, propelling me forward. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a sign that someone was coming after me. When I finally reached the edge of the village, I spotted a small cottage with a dim porch light glowing. Panting and disoriented, I stumbled toward it, praying someone was home. I banged on the door, desperation in every knock. The door creaked open, revealing a concerned face, a middle-aged man, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What happened?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I collapsed into a chair, gasping for air. "I was ambushed," I managed to say between breaths. "There's a group. They tricked me. They've got my car." The man's expression darkened, and without hesitation, he reached for the phone. Minutes later, flashing blue and red lights lit up the night as the police arrived. I sat on the cottage steps, wrapped in a blanket the resident had given me, watching as officers questioned me and pieced together what had happened. I gave them every detail I could remember: the old woman, the 2 children, the gang that had dragged me into the house. The officers exchanged grim looks, already familiar with the kind of operation I had stumbled into. They assured me they would search the area and recover my car, though I could tell from their tone that they expected the gang to have vanished long before now. When the officers arrived at the old house, they found it abandoned, just as I feared. There was no sign of the old woman or the children, no trace of the men who had ambushed me, only the mess they'd left behind and the empty space where my car should have been. The officers offered me a ride home, and I accepted, too exhausted to do anything else. I stared out the window as the patrol car hummed along the road, the quiet village fading into the distance. As we neared my home, I tried to process what had happened, but the fear sat heavy in my chest. I had fallen so easily into their trap, my kindness exploited without hesitation. I couldn't help but wonder how often they had done this before, and if they would do it again. The officers dropped me off at my house, giving me a few final reassurances before driving away into the night. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, trying to convince myself I was safe. Inside, I sat on the edge of my bed, my thoughts racing. I knew I should be grateful to be alive, but all I could think about was how close I had come to something far worse. It had been a good night. I hadn't laughed that hard in a long time. My niece's birthday party had been a welcome break from everything. But now, hours later, exhaustion had settled in. The quiet hum of the car engine, the rhythmic flash of streetlights along the highway, and the long stretch of empty road were lulling me into a dangerous kind of drowsiness. There were still miles to cover before I'd get home, and I knew I needed a break. I spotted the flickering lights of a gas station up ahead, dim against the backdrop of the night. Perfect. I could refuel, stretch my legs, and shake off the fatigue before the final stretch. The gas station looked deserted. No other cars, just a couple of flickering overhead lights and a handful of operational pumps. I pulled in slowly, parked near one of the pumps, and killed the engine. I climbed out of the car, the cool night air brushing against my face. The world felt strangely still, just the hum of the distant highway and the faint buzz of the gas station's neon sign. I glanced toward the small convenience store, noticing the glow of fluorescent lights inside. That's when I saw them. Two men, both wearing ski masks, standing by the counter. Their voices were loud and frantic, though muffled by the glass door. My stomach twisted. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get in the car and drive away. But I was rooted to the spot, trying to figure out if I could help. Should I call the police? Should I just leave? Before I could act, one of the masked men turned toward the door and saw me. It all happened so fast. The door burst open, and the man with the gun stepped out, his movements sharp and precise. "Get over here," he barked, the gun aimed directly at me. Fear flooded through me. My hands went up instinctively, and I was yanked forward by the collar of my jacket. They didn't give me a chance to resist. Within seconds, I was dragged inside the store, the cold metal of the gun pressed hard against my ribs. The other robber was already moving, shouting orders at the cashier, stuffing cash into a duffel bag. I could hear the panic in his voice. This wasn't going according to plan. "Out back," the man holding me hissed. "Take him out back!" I stumbled as they forced me toward the rear exit, the world narrowing to the cold barrel of the gun digging into my side. They shoved me out the back door, and I hit the ground hard, the cold pavement stinging through my clothes. I stayed down, hands raised in a pathetic attempt to show them I wasn't going to fight. The area behind the gas station was dark and desolate. Beyond it lay a stretch of forest, its trees swaying in the night breeze. The hum of the highway drifted faintly in the background, a distant reminder that normal life was just beyond reach. The robbers stood over me, their breath heavy, muttering frantically to each other. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation, something about time running out, something about things going wrong. I sat there, frozen in place. I couldn't think, couldn't move. All I knew was that I needed to stay quiet and still, hoping they'd let me go if I didn't make a sound. Then, just as my fear reached a breaking point, I heard it. A faint wail, far off but getting louder. Sirens. The sirens were growing louder, their piercing wail cutting through the silence of the night. The robbers stiffened, exchanging panicked glances. His hands shook as he clutched the duffel bag, his breath coming out in short bursts. "We gotta move," the other one snapped, his voice low but frantic. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to shoot. But then, as if deciding I wasn't worth the trouble, he lowered the gun. They looked toward the forest behind the gas station, a dark expanse that promised cover, if they could reach it in time. Without another word, they bolted toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows just as the first flickers of red and blue lights illuminated the back of the station. I stayed where I was, frozen to the ground. The fear rooted me in place, as if staying still could keep me invisible. Moments later, the area flooded with the sound of slamming car doors and shouted commands. Officers stormed the gas station, their flashlights slicing through the dark. "Clear the building," someone yelled, and a team rushed inside, sweeping the store for anyone still hiding. An officer spotted me crouched near the back wall, his flashlight blinding in the night. "Hey you, are you hurt?" I shook my head, struggling to find my voice. "I know I'm fine." My words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. The officer reached down, helping me to my feet. My legs wobbled beneath me, but I managed to stand. "They went into the forest," I stammered. The officer nodded and radioed the others. "They're on foot, headed into the woods. We need units in the forest perimeter." Minutes crawled by like hours as I stood by one of the police cars. Wrapped in a blanket an officer had draped over my shoulders. The world around me felt surreal. Flashing lights, distant voices, and the low hum of the police radio. A search team had gone into the forest, following the path the robbers had taken. I stared into the dark, trying to focus on the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional shout from an officer. Then, I saw them. Two officers emerged from the woods, each holding a handcuffed man by the arm. The robbers looked exhausted, their faces hidden beneath angry scowls. They didn't put up a fight as the officers marched them toward the police cars. The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. I let out a shaky breath, realizing just how close I had come to something far worse. Once the robbers were secured in the back of the squad cars, an officer returned to speak with me. "You're lucky," he said. "We got here just in time. A truck driver passing by noticed something off and called us." The thought of the truck driver, a stranger who had unknowingly saved my life, hit me hard. I hadn't even known how close the danger was until it was over. The officer asked a few more questions, making sure I was okay to drive. I assured him I was, though my hands still trembled slightly. He gave me a reassuring nod and escorted me back to my car. As I sat behind the wheel, I took a moment to steady my breathing. The gas station was still buzzing with activity, officers moving in and out of the store, checking every corner. I started the engine, the familiar hum of the car feeling like a lifeline. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and with one last glance at the gas station, I pulled out onto the highway. The glow of the gas station grew smaller in the rearview mirror, shrinking into the night as I drove away. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic passing of streetlights felt different now, less soothing, more fragile. I knew I was safe, but the events of the night lingered like a shadow, a reminder of how quickly things could change. The highway stretched out before me, empty and quiet once again. But this time, I couldn't help but feel that even the most routine moments held the potential for danger.